evening. From the Voice of America studios in Washington, D.C., I'm Ayesha Tanzeem, and you're watching The Platform. Tonight, we are going to talk about Afghanistan, Pakistan, and the endgame. And joining me here to talk about these issues are General Richard Myers, who was the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and he was also the principal military advisor to the President, the Secretary of Defense, and the National Security Council during the earliest stages of the war on terror. And Brian Katulis is a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress, where he focuses on U.S. security policy in the Middle East and South Asia. Welcome to you both.
Thank you.
Soon we will be joined by our guests in Islamabad with our host Waqas. We're having some technical problems. As soon as they're resolved, we'll go to Islamabad. But starting here in Washington, General Myers, first question to you. We had General Pervez Musharraf right here in our studios yesterday, who said that he made no deals with the U.S. on drone strikes. Now, how is it possible that the U.S. has been carrying out these strikes for so long with impunity, without a deal, or without at least an understanding?
You know, as far as I know, there never was a deal between the United States and Pakistan on drone strikes, at least while I was in service. But I think both sides understood the imperative on the U.S. side, for instance, to go after high-ranking members of al-Qaeda. Osama bin Laden would be case in point. And then the same understanding on the Pakistani side that if you do this, we're a sovereign country, we have to oppose it. And so I think there was that understanding among all the players that this is it's a very serious act when you're a sovereign country and you start shooting. That's clearly a...
Brian.
I agree with what the general said. I mean, I would be surprised if there was some sort of written document, because if there were, it'd be in the Pakistani press or it would be in WikiLeaks quite a lot. But I think there was a real understanding around 2006, 2007 that the U.S. was going to move, and in coordination with Pakistani authorities, despite all of the public protests and all of my discussions with people in the Pakistani security establishment, they acknowledged that the drones were an effective tool, are an effective tool at times against the interests that are fighting them and killing their own people.
Okay, now let's go to Islamabad, where our guests are ready. Waqas, over to you.
Thank you, Ayesha, and welcome to your guests who are present with you in the studios there, General Myers and Brian. And of course, as you said in the beginning, we are going to discuss the future of Afghanistan, and many details related to some of the developments and strategies that are being adopted and that will be acted upon are still unclear. And some like to describe the situation as very confusing in Afghanistan at this point of time. So we'll explore all of that and many other questions. Let me welcome the panel of distinguished guests that I have. With me in the studios here in Islamabad is ABM Shahzad Chaudhry. He's the former Deputy Air Chief of the Pakistan Air Force. Welcome, Mr. Chaudhry, for joining us again on the platform. And we have Sardar Asif Ahmed Ali, former Foreign Minister, who's joining us in the Lahore from Lahore, as a matter of fact. Welcome, Sardar Asif, to the platform tonight. And I want to begin with Mr. Chaudhry first of all. We've had U.S. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton very recently visit Islamabad. She's been visiting some Central Asian states also, and she's been saying that there are some other ways to go about cooperating with the United States in the situation that has erupted at the moment. For example, she's been talking about cutting off money to networks, and of course cutting off supply routes, and of course she's hinting towards the Haqqani network that has been at the center of dispute between the two countries recently. Don't you think that these two options that Ms. Clinton has been talking about is something that Pakistan can act upon rather than going for a military offensive in North Waziristan?
Well, I think Pakistan very much welcomes the new sort of strategy that is being formed for dealing with the endgame in Afghanistan, and especially the groups that perhaps continue to be inimical to U.S. interests in Afghanistan. Pakistan has been saying this for a long time, that you have two planks, the military plank as well as the political plank. And the political plank, perhaps along with some other intelligence-based functions, could bring about the necessary pressure to bring some sense in these groups, and also to enable them to come to the negotiating table, which is ultimately the end objective that we must all work for. Our basic combined objective of both US and Pakistan in Afghanistan, and of course that of Afghanistan has been in Afghanistan, is to bring about peace and stability. And as long as we can bring about peace and stability, regardless of the route that we take to peace and stability, I think that's been the bone of contention between the US and Pakistan. And I'm glad both sides have sort of come to agreement as to how to proceed together in unison, moving towards a work mode or a work action, which will possibly be coordinated and combined to bring about the results that we wish to achieve.
Okay, let's go towards Sardar Asif, who's here with us in Lahore. And at the recently All Parties Conference, Sardar Asif, you would remember, after there were allegations from the US that the ISI was a veritable, that the Haqqani network was the veritable arm of the ISI, there was the All Parties Conference, and all political parties had agreed upon going for peace talks and negotiations, and were not very appreciative of any kind of further military action. Do you think that the Pakistanis sometimes misjudge the leverage that they enjoy allegedly over the Haqqani network? What if the network turned against Pakistan itself?
That's of course always likely, but after all, this is our country, and Mr. Haqqani is an alien, he's a foreigner, and whether he's an invited guest or uninvited guest, I don't know. But a lot of his network is alleged to be in Pakistan. Now, coming back to your earlier statement, and the Vice Marshal has said very correctly that there's a lot of, it seems that there's some confusion in formulation of policy in Washington. And that confusion was fairly obvious to me when Mrs. Clinton was here, because she was blowing hot one day and cold one day. I mean, the words that she used weren't very friendly. I mean, she went on to say that it's days and weeks, no more. So it came as a very quite shocking to me. Number one, that the delegation was so high-powered, and number two, behind all those fineries and the fine words that I expressed in in the media, there was also this underlying threat. It's days and weeks and no more. So the message I get is that they're not particularly clear on where they want to take the whole Afghanistan scene. And they seem to be confused, they seem to be in a hurry to give results to the US public, because 2012 is an election year. So I have an overwhelming feeling that it's the elections in US which is dictating the Afghan policy in Washington, rather than the ground reality in Pakistan or in Afghanistan. That's the message I got from this high-powered, high-profile visit of US officials in Pakistan.
Right. So you think there's lots of confusion regarding what to do when the endgame of Afghanistan has already arrived. Let's direct that towards General Myers. And General Myers, you just heard Sardar Asif, and in line with what he said, I would like to draw your attention towards the fact that you took over as the Joint Chief of Staff back in October 2001, and in February next year, you told reporters in New Delhi that although the Taliban had been toppled in Afghanistan, they had been replaced, but threat to peace in Afghanistan remained, and it would stay unless some leadership of the Taliban and Al-Qaeda could have been captured, and the situation in Afghanistan could have been secured. But now, so many years after you'd said that, we know that Osama bin Laden has been killed, and the drawdown of troops has already begun. Do you think that Afghanistan has become more secure now, or would you reconsider what you'd said back then?
No, I think Afghanistan is probably, in one sense, a lot more secure today than it was when I left office in 2005. When I left office in 2005, the Taliban weren't much of a factor, and it was the next couple of years where the Taliban reemergence started to threaten the central government in Kabul. So I think from a purely military standpoint, security has improved since the 2006-2007 timeframe, but some things have not improved. And I think when you go to Kabul and you look at the ability of the government to govern, to provide good governance to the various provinces and so forth. That has not gotten better in my view. Plus, we still have the issue, as we've been talking about, of the safe havens for some of the Taliban in Pakistan. So, yeah, in some respects I think we're better. In other respects I think there's a lot of work to do. And I would just finally say the only way we're going to get this done, if we want a stable and secure Afghanistan, is for the United States, NATO, and Pakistan to be very closely allied on that effort. It's going to take all of our efforts to create an Afghanistan that is stable into the future.
Let me pick up on something that they said in Pakistan. And Brian, I'll ask you, are these elections in U.S., as they said, that's actually having the biggest impact on the policy in Afghanistan because 2012 is an election year?
I doubt it, and this is why. The number one thing that is driving the elections here are the problems here at home. The economy, the job situation, and other things. Not that this is not a factor, but the simple fact of the matter is that most Americans aren't paying attention to what's going on over there. And I think this president has maximum leverage to do what he wants to do. He, yes, has some complaints from the left-wing base of the Democratic Party, but they're not organized in such a way that it would impact the elections one way or the other. The Republican candidates for president are all over the map. They're unclear. So there's no real political challenge in the way that I think George Bush experienced in 2005, 2006. The forces aren't there. I think what's going on here is a very, very challenging policy issue, where I would agree with General Myers' general assessment, but the one thing that I think I saw differently on my last trip to Afghanistan is that the levels of civilian casualties among the Afghan civilians are at an all-time high this year. It's still very deadly. The vast majority of those deaths are caused by the Taliban insurgency. It's not the international forces or the Afghan forces. And when I was in Kabul and we talked to many senior leaders in the Afghan government, they were asking us as Americans, why are you, the Americans, offering support to Pakistan while they're sending people over here to kill us? And this was the perception from Afghan leaders, including Pashtun leaders. And that alarmed me quite a lot, that if Pakistan wants to have a constructive relationship with its neighbor in Afghanistan, there was a trust deficit on the Afghanistan-Pakistan side. We talk about U.S.-Pakistan trust deficit. But that thing alarmed me the most, the point that they were saying, look, you Americans are offering this unconditional support to a number of Pakistani forces, and they have this haven over there.
Yes, Waqar, go ahead. I think you want to ask something.
Yeah, I just want to ask Mr. Brian, he's just said that there are many in Afghanistan who's saying that why is the United States supporting Pakistan when it's sending fighters there to fight? Now, I just want to draw attention towards the statement that the Afghan President Hamid Karzai has made, and it is, some have been describing it as very dramatic, Brian, and he said that God forbids if a war breaks out between US and Pakistan, Afghanistan will side with Pakistan. What do you make of this statement? Why would Mr. Karzai say that so many years after the war?
Well, it's hard for me as an analyst to explain President Karzai's statement because he said that on a Monday, and then on a Tuesday he contradicted himself and corrected what he said. He's done this before. You remember in the last 2 years he had threatened to join the Taliban insurgency when he had a not-so-good meeting with President Obama. So I actually have a very difficult time as an analyst that looks at policy, evaluating the very mixed statements that come from the Afghan leadership. And I think in part he feels under pressure from a number of different forces, including the Pakistani leadership. There was a very senior delegation earlier this spring that went to Kabul and tried to convince Hamid Karzai of a different sort of strategy, as was reported, and it doesn't seem like he was convinced of that. And I think if you look at his statements towards Pakistan in the last 2 weeks, when he canceled the trilateral dialogue between the U.S., Pakistan, and Afghanistan, and General Myers mentioned that core relationship between these three countries, I think it's essential. And I think all of the actors and the leaders in both countries need to come together and understand that we actually share common and strategic goals. We're going to disagree on the tactics towards those goals, but we need to continue to work together if we're going to see stability.
General Myers, there's a lot of talk about Hillary Clinton's trip to Pakistan. Not many people are talking about what was General David Petraeus doing there, what was General Martin Dempsey doing there. They met with their counterparts for hours and hours. What was happening there?
I think what was happening was a reaction after Admiral Mullen's remarks right before he retired at the end of September was to say, listen, Admiral Mullen may have been right. nevertheless, we have to work on this trust between the United States and Pakistan. There's been a trust deficit for some time now, and I think it was an attempt to start to rebuild that trust. So you send over your senior military person, you send over your senior intelligence person, you send over your Secretary of State, and I think it was a powerful message that the United States really cares about this relationship and wants to start working the details of how do we rebuild our trust and deal with this very real problem of instability and insecurity in Afghanistan, and some of which has come over into Pakistan and caused Pakistan to be, to some degree, insecure as well.
We're talking about a trust deficit between America and Pakistan. Let me go back to my guests in Islamabad, and whichever one of you wants to take this question. This idea that a lot of Afghans resent Pakistan because they say that Pakistan supporting people who are coming there and killing us has come up again and again during our discussions. Do you think Pakistan will be better off if it kind of scales back and gives Afghans room to breathe and works towards that resentment? AVM Chaudhry, you can answer me, and then Sardar Asif, you can also pick up on that.
Suffocating the Afghans, Pakistan?
Yeah, I don't know how much of leverage Pakistan has on these groups, but certainly, I mean, I can imagine that there are contexts, and Ms. Hillary Clinton said that very clearly when she said that Pakistan had enabled contacts between these groups and the CIA recently and the American side for some sort of negotiation initiation. So if those are the kind of contacts that Pakistan has had, those can be very helpful in the end game of Afghanistan. Talking about safe havens in Pakistan, what people in Pakistan are saying literally at this moment is that about 60% of Afghanistan does not have the writ of the Afghan government because of the strategy that has been applied in Afghanistan in the last few years, and the plan to protect the population bases rather than all of Afghanistan, which of course was impossible with the 130,000 troops that were there. What has happened is that the Afghan Taliban have sort of found resurgence in those areas that were vacated, especially Nuristan and Kunar, two provinces which actually are the adjoining provinces, where many Pakistani Taliban have now gone and taken positions there and created a safe haven for themselves for quite some time now. In the last few weeks, last few months, we've had a number of attacks emerging out of the Afghan havens of these Taliban and coming out and attacking Pakistani positions, Pakistani people. Pakistani children have been abducted. They're still with the Afghan, and these groups are there. And so Pakistan has also been making a lot of noise in terms of asking the NATO and the American troops in terms of countering and in terms of holding these groups to some sort of an accountability. Right. I think this process must stay on both sides, because if I may continue, because it's essential to ensure, and this is exactly what Ms. Clinton also acknowledged when she was here this time. So I think there's a problem on both sides. You have a 60% Afghanistan, which is almost now implicitly a safe haven, and you have actual safe haven on the Afghan side, where you have the two provinces handed over to the Pakistani Taliban, Kunar and Nuristan, and then of course in the Pakistani side belt you have since 2002 these groups that have come and entrenched themselves there. So I think we have a major problem at hand. Rather than sharing and like a ping pong sending the blame on either side, we need to work together, and that's been the cumulative effect of this particular.
This is exactly what I was coming to, Mr. Chaudhry, that we need to work together, Pakistan and US. General Mai said that the both countries need to make more efforts of finding out how to work together. Sardar Asif, I want to ask you, what are some of the steps that you have in mind that you could suggest to Pakistan and the United States that they could take in order to make more efforts to work together?
You see, I have a point of view on this, and I have been, last 1 month, I have been going on the air with this point of view. I think the Americans will have to, or ISAF, Washington will have to correct their assumptions about Afghanistan and about Pakistan. Now, right now, I don't think there is any political, within Afghanistan, any political process going on to bring the militant opposition on the table. There appears to be absolutely no move whatsoever. We used to hear something some months ago that in Qatar or in Istanbul there something has been set up, but one has not heard of anything yet. So the message that I get is that there is no American move for a political dialogue or a process of negotiations with the Taliban leaders. That's Mr. Haqqani here in the east, Mullah Omar in the south. There appears to be nothing. So what do the Americans expect? Do they expect a military victory in Afghanistan? I don't think anybody is going to get a military victory in Afghanistan. Neither the Afghans can get a military victory as long as the ISAF forces are there, nor the ISAF forces can completely overwhelm and pacify Afghanistan, totally. There'll always be trouble as long as there are foreign troops in Afghanistan. At least the Pashtun population of Afghanistan will have a cause célèbre to fight against it. Now, therefore, they must.
You're talking about whether there's a political dialogue going on. I'd like to take that question and throw it to my guests in Washington. Before I come to you guys, though, we have to go for a break, so we'll be right back with this question after this break. Don't go anywhere.
Welcome back. You are watching The Platform, and tonight we are discussing the end game in Afghanistan. We will try to seek clarification from our panel of distinguished guests about so many topics that are of a matter of confusion to many in this region and also across the globe. And before we went on the break, Sardar, Asif was talking about the presence of troops in Afghanistan. And regarding that, I want to ask you, Mr. Chaudhry, there's a strategic partnership declaration between Afghanistan and the United States, and many say that it is about the permanent bases of the United States in Afghanistan. Do you think that the presence of the troops through those bases is going to be good for Afghanistan? We have players such as Iran in the region, there's China. Do you think that that is a good idea after all? And what do you think is happening on that front?
I think a couple of things that perhaps the region as well as the main players, which is Afghanistan, Pakistan and the US, will perhaps need to keep in mind is what has been the effect of the US troops till date. I mean, if we found relative stability, it is something that the US troops can deliver. But if not, and we've not been able to really defeat the Taliban as such, victory in irregular wars is relative. I mean, it's never a finalized thing. It's never a finality in any shape and form. So if you look at that, then we've got to see what can be the role of any remnant troops that will be there in Afghanistan. If the role is going to be to retain the structure, the political structure, and sustain that for some time, and they can provide some sort of a support, I think they can play a positive role. More importantly, the regional countries will have to be involved into this. How does Russia look at it? How does China look at it? How does Iran look at it, for example? And how do Pakistan and Afghanistan look at it? Now, Pakistan and Afghanistan may go along with some sort of such a strategy for a little while. But then you got to see, after the major portion of the American forces leave, what is the remnant effect of those forces in Afghanistan? Does the strife continue? Is there a reaction that they need to look out for? Those are the kind of things that will determine what can be the stability. Also the capacity of the US. How much can they sustain those forces in the US, right, depending upon their own internal situation in terms of economy, etc. So I think those factors will determine as to what can be the usefulness as well as the sustainability of such an
General Myers, I just want to ask you a question related to this. Does the United States want to have permanent bases in Afghanistan?
You know, I don't know. I've not seen the U.S. policy. Let me just respond to comments that your two panelists have brought up. One is, I think they're absolutely right. If you look at the history of insurgencies, very few of them have ever been solved through just the use of military force. So other things have to play in this, and that's the diplomatic and political instrument of power, the economic instrument of power, and I don't think it'll ever be solved just through the military alone. We also have to realize that Afghanistan is a sovereign country. They have a constitution. They vote for their parliamentarians. they have their leadership, and they're the ones that will decide whether or not they want to have a relationship with the United States to go forward in terms of perhaps training and mentoring their national army and perhaps their police. I think those are the two areas where the United States, where NATO can help the most. Perhaps even Pakistan, India can help in those areas as well if we can learn to all work together there. But those will be the needs, I think, going forward. So I don't know that official U.S. policy towards bases there, but we have to realize Afghanistan is a sovereign nation and they'll make their own decisions.
Brian, let me come back to something that we were talking about before the break, and we promised we'll come back to it after the break, which is Sardar Asif was saying he doesn't see U.S. taking any initiative in terms of talking, and Hillary Clinton was just in Pakistan saying we'll talk and we'll fight.
Right.
Where is the talking?
Well, Ambassador Mark Grossman has been charged as his #1 priority to explore the possibilities of a peace settlement, and he's doing that with his team behind the scenes. I think there are 3 challenges here. First, there's a challenge of synchronizing U.S. and NATO policy so that we have a fight-talk strategy. Oftentimes the fight and the talk pieces are not all that well coordinated, in part because of the nature of the threat we're trying to deal with. We don't know what the bottom line positions of different elements of this group we label the Taliban, which is very amorphous. But it's synchronizing who we're trying to fight and who should be at the negotiating table. We're in the very early stages of this, and I actually think this is going to be a process that will go on long beyond 2014, but we need to be very serious about the diplomacy and synchronizing the diplomacy with the fight talk. The second challenge, I would say, is Pakistan also has a fight talk strategy of its own. And I think this is where I think we need to get down to brass tacks and understand each other's interests, because I don't think they're that far out of alignment. I think the tactics, we have a serious debate over who might be able to be brought into a political process and who needs to be killed, or we need to combat with military force. But we need to synchronize our strategies not only internally, but we need actually Pakistan to work with us and work together. And I think some of these elements are actually already underway despite all of the public statements. Behind the scenes, we have very senior, serious officials looking at ways we can synchronize our policies.
Talking about fight talk, is there any chance that there'll be less of a fight and more of a talk? Some are complaining, how can you talk when you're fighting so much?
Well, I think what we've learned over time, I think most countries, is that you need both force and diplomacy. And sometimes you don't know who's wearing what hat, actually, when you talk about force and diplomacy. Both can be very forceful. But I think it's, you need to keep pressure on people to bring them to a table, at least in my opinion, where they can begin talking. So I don't think you allow the Taliban in Afghanistan, for instance, to continue to threaten the stability of the central government or provincial government officials or city officials while you're waiting for them to come to the table. I think it has to go hand in hand, and probably a little too crude, but a carrot and stick approach to bring people to a table where they can then determine what's in their own best interest and is their way forward here.
Thank you very much, and I'll take this question back to Sardar Asif, who discussed all this fight and talk and whether the U.S. is talking or not. Sardar Asif, Pakistan, according to Brian Katulis here, has its own fight and talk strategy, and we also know Hillary Clinton accepted it, that Pakistanis helped bring Haqqanis to the table once. Why aren't Pakistanis able to bring them to the table again? What's stopping them?
Direct that question towards Sardar Asif, Ayesha, in a moment, but first AVM Shahzad Chaudhry wants to add to what was being said.
Very briefly, we're looking for space to be able to bring people to the table. Now, how is that space going to be created? Through the military means or through negotiation or political means? That's something that perhaps we need to clarify. In the US, the thought seems to be that the war action or the military action must go along in terms of, and then trying to bring people to talk. Now, for the last 10 years, we've tried the military means, both sides of the border, and we haven't really succeeded. The Afghans continue to be resurgent, the Afghans continue to be imposing themselves in various ways. Now, if that be the case, I think the military plank has not delivered, and the earlier that we accept it in Washington, I think the easier it will be for us to manage our way forward. Secondly, as the closure comes to Afghanistan within a year or so, or a couple of years, given 2014 as the final date that American troops must move out, hopefully with some stability, I don't think Pakistan can then now initiate at this moment, when a closure is coming to Afghanistan, a major operation or a major action against groups that straddle both sides of the border and can become an abiding threat for Pakistan if we take them to war. America can kill its way out of war. Pakistan cannot kill its way out of the war, because you've got to live in the same vicinity amongst the same people.
Okay.
And we have same people straddling both sides of the border. So I think if Washington is little sensitive to how Pakistan looks at it, and also the fact that the military means have not delivered, perhaps both of us can work together. And to just final point, we got the Haqqanis to the table without taking them to war in Pakistan. I think we can take them to the table again without going to war.
And this was what Ayesha had asked Sardar Asif. And Sardar Asif, the question for you, that Pakistan has its own fight and talk strategy, and also that Ms. Clinton had said that Pakistan helped bring the Haqqani network to the negotiating table. Could Pakistan do that once again? How do you look at this? Are you there, Sardar Asif? Can you hear me? I'm afraid we are having some audio problems with Sardar Asif. And looking at this issue of permanent bases of US in Afghanistan, Mr. Chaudhry, people who are in favor of that presence there say that if those bases remain in Afghanistan for a long, long time, that's the only way that Taliban would be prevented from coming back into power in Afghanistan. If that's the case, actually, then what has 10 years of war achieved in Afghanistan? Couldn't that be a question there?
Yeah, that's very much a question. Also the fact that perhaps Afghans themselves first need to decide whether they need those bases and how long do they need the bases, whether they need the bases at all. Now that's a major question which actually is bedeviling many Afghans. Even I believe, and I'm told that the Afghan government thinks of it in various ways. So that's going to be a question and an issue to be resolved in Afghanistan. But I said in the larger picture, we got to see how does the neighborhood react to it. What is it that the military plank actually brings to the table? Perhaps for a year and a half, something that can sustain the political order that is left behind in Afghanistan. And more importantly, much more importantly than the military bases there, I think it shall be how the regional countries, Pakistan in particular, Iran definitely, and other countries, Afghanistan itself, how can we help Afghanistan stand on its own feet? And perhaps that is going to be the aim and objective of the Istanbul conference on 2nd November.
Right. Ayesha, I'm afraid your question remains pending because of Sardar Asif not been able to listen to us, but we can ask him that later. Brian, you've just heard Mr. Chaudhry speak on the permanent bases issue, and many say that, related to this topic of course, that the United States should realize that the opposition that it is facing right now is not from Al-Qaeda but from the ordinary Afghans in Afghanistan themselves.
Well, first on the permanent bases issue, I agree with everything that the other guests said here. This is going to be an Afghan decision, and I think it'll also be a U.S. decision, as we're seeing in the case of Iraq and what happened over the last couple of days. These are complicated questions that must be decided by the political leadership of both countries. On the issue of opposition to the international presence and the U.S. and ISAF presence, certainly I think there's some metrics that demonstrate that that's the case, but the opposition is nowhere near what we saw in places like Iraq. And I think what strikes me the most, and I mentioned this before, most of the civilian deaths in Afghanistan, the vast majority, more than 80% of it, is caused by the insurgency. And I think my experience in Afghanistan is that there isn't this wellspring of opposition to having an international presence there when there's so much threat faced by the ordinary Afghan citizens. And I think sort of these issues, I would rather turn our discussion a little bit more to this fight talk business, because I actually think that's the core and the centerpiece of how do you get to stability in that part of the world. I wouldn't want to take either option off the table, and I think Pakistan's own experience in the deals that it signed in Swat and in South Waziristan demonstrates that sometimes when you try diplomacy, it doesn't actually lead to sustainable outcomes, and then you need to actually use military force against militant groups that kill innocent civilians. It's a difficult lesson, but it's one that we need to keep in mind, because I think the military sort of cooperative approach and a diplomatic approach aren't mutually exclusive, and the best approach is when those two tracks are integrated.
Brian, I want to pick up on that and throw it to General Myers. Brian is saying sometimes you have to fight to bring them to talk, but we also heard Mr. Chaudhry saying Pakistan cannot kill its way out of dealing with the Haqqanis. They're living in the same vicinity. Is the U.S. sensitive to those interests?
Oh, I think so. I don't think there's anybody in the U.S. that I know, and particularly when I was still in office, that thought we could kill our way out of anything. I think that is a crude and perhaps even inflammatory way to talk about it. We're talking about instruments of power, the military instrument, diplomatic, political, economic. Clearly the military plays a role, has played a role, has made, I would still say, Afghanistan more secure than it was when the Taliban reemerged in 2006 and 2007. Having said that, you know, it's going to take all these instruments of national power. I think the one instrument that has not been used as effectively as it could is the diplomatic political. And that's where the countries need to focus on that particular instrument of power. And those countries need to be the United States and Afghanistan and Pakistan in particular, until we arrive at, you know, what can we mutually agree on as a way forward here, and perhaps get to the negotiating table where you can negotiate some of the threat away. Maybe not all of it.
Brian, if this is true, if U.S. is sensitive that Pakistan cannot really fight with the Haqqanis, then what do they mean when they say do more?
Well, I think what they mean is when we have clear evidence of attacks perpetrated against either Afghans or U.S. forces in Kabul, please help us stop that. At bare minimum, I think that's that. And I don't want to read in too much of Admiral Mullen's statements, but I think he, as the former top military advisor to the president, was deeply frustrated that American soldiers were killed at the hands of forces that were controlled by Pakistan. There's no debating that at all. We can debate whether the phrase, the Haqqanis are a veritable arm of an ISI. That's an interesting debate, but there's no debate about the facts of the matter. And I think he was expressing a frustration there that we need to actually stop the violence and work together on all of this. I tend to believe that those sort of expressions are best delivered behind the scenes. It's much more constructive to do that quietly. And I think this is what's happening right now, is to have a candid discussion to say, look, more instability, and we recognize that in eastern Afghanistan, it's a problem for Pakistan. Similarly, I think the other way, Pakistan instability is a problem for eastern Afghanistan.
Waqas, if I can just throw Brian's comments to Mr. Chaudhry and say, Mr. Chaudhry, how would you respond to what Brian just said?
I would certainly request Brian to reformulate the word controlled, Pakistan-controlled Taliban that are killing American soldiers or Afghan citizens. I think that's a rather harsh statement. Even when Taliban were in power, unfortunately, the Pakistani government or the Pakistani agencies had very little control over how the policies were formulated in Afghanistan, and that brought the end of the Taliban rule. 9/11, of course, occurred immediately after, and therefore it became difficult to sort of sustain that structure. And then Pakistan changed tack, and Pakistan said, if this is what 9/11 has delivered, we're absolutely, we are not going to support the Taliban at all. I think that needs to be corrected. As far as the Pakistani and Brian's this particular statement in terms of America asking Pakistan to help stop these attacks in some ways and means, I think whatever is the leverage of Pakistan, Pakistan must exercise that. And I greatly and truly support that. But having said this, if all these, there are currently 3 provinces just on the eastern border of Afghanistan, adjacent to the Pakistan border, Khost, Paktia and Paktika, entirely in the control of the Haqqani network. There are 4 other provinces which are almost dominated by the Haqqanis. You have 7 such provinces in Afghanistan in which Haqqani dominates. I wonder, in the last 10 years, why hasn't an action been taken against those Haqqani networks if there's such a threat today? Then the travel from, after they're assuming that they leave the Pakistani bases to attack Kabul and the US embassy. I mean, it's a long travel, it's a long physical distance, geographical distance. Why is it that the American forces, ISAF forces, NATO forces could not, none of them could interdict these forces right when this was happening? I feel there is a lot that we tend to overlook when we want to look at the nuts and bolts of how things happen. I think the better thing is to look at Ms. Clinton's visit, look at the positives, see that both sides have agreed that there are gaps on the perceptions, assumptions, presumptions on both sides, and we need to work together to cover those, as well as bring a closure to Afghanistan in a peaceful manner, because after all, the stability in Afghanistan is what matters in the end, not the means to that end. Okay. And I think that's an area that perhaps we could sort of move over and look beyond.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chaudhry. Before coming back to Washington, we have to take a quick break. We will be right back.
Welcome back. You're watching The Platform, and tonight we're discussing the end game in Afghanistan. What are the issues that are crucial to stability and prosperity in Afghanistan now that the drawdown of troops has already begun? And we are happy to announce that the connection with Sardar Asif Ahmed Ali, our guest in Lahore, has been resumed. And I would like to ask you the same question that we could not ask you earlier, Sardar Asif, about fighting and talking strategy. A comment was made in Washington that Pakistan has had its own fight and talk strategy, and that Ms. Clinton has been saying on a recent visit that Pakistan had helped Haqqani network come to the negotiating table in the past. So maybe Pakistan could help achieve that again. How do you look at that?
I think this is a very positive approach, and I think now the ball is being thrown in our court. And my own advice to the government would be, and it has been the last 2 months, that we are being blamed for harboring the Haqqani network, and we are being blamed for harboring the Quetta Shura, and therefore Mullah Umar. And the general perception is that Mullah Umar and Rabbani are amenable to advice from Pakistan. Now, I think this is a great window of opportunity for Pakistan, and if at this time we are able to ask them or their representatives to start a process of dialogue with the ISAF forces in general and with the US administration in particular, I think it will be a great feather in our cap, and I think the US government will welcome this. And I think Pakistan can emerge once again out of its what's often called isolation. Although I don't call that isolation, we just become members of the Security Council. But isolation with the Western powers, with the NATO powers, I think this will be one of the best things Pakistan can do.
You think that this is a great role that Pakistan could play in improving the situation? Brian, I want to ask you, what is the hope that you see for the ordinary Afghan people? Because there's a fear in the ordinary Afghans, if you come across what is being reported in the press, that they fear that the amount of aid would be cut down. They also fear that corruption and crime could rise once again, and that some social gains that have been made because of the war effort in Afghanistan so far would be reversed when the foreign troops leave Afghanistan. How do you look at this? What's the hope for Afghans then? Is the future bleak?
Great nations like Pakistan and all of Afghanistan's neighbors offer more constructive support to Afghanistan. That's the centerpiece of the struggle. I think the #1 fear that Afghan citizens have right now is of dying at the hands of insurgents, that many of whom have ties to the territory in Pakistan. The second thing I think they look for is more constructive support, not only from the security side, but also economic linkages to their neighbors like Pakistan. This will take a long time. But the only hope that I see for a landlocked country like Afghanistan is if it integrates itself with all of its neighbors, as difficult and unrealistic as that may sound today. But I think there's a future there that come 2020, come 2025, if countries like Pakistan offer the best that they can deliver to a place like Afghanistan, as opposed to being engaged in sort of these tit-for-tat games with the United States, I actually think that part of the world has a great possibility for tremendous growth. But it'll only come from leadership and from making sure that we integrate tough diplomacy with all of the security measures that are currently underway.
So now we only have a minute and a half into the show, and I want to ask you very quickly, after Professor Rabbani's death, there was a fear that talks have totally stopped. Are there back channel things going on? Are we watching positive developments?
I think it's so important for both Pakistan, Afghanistan, and the United States that you have to know there are back channel talks. This has to be priority number one, is to get things back on track. How far they've progressed, I don't know, but you have to know that they're taking place.
Brian,
I think it would be unwise not to continue to test the possibilities. As difficult as it is, when somebody like Dr. Rabbani was murdered brutally, you still need to forge ahead to see if there's a possibility for peace.
Thank you very much, General Myers and Brian Katulis. That's all the time we have in Washington. Thank you very much for watching us in Washington, D.C. From the VOA studios. I'm Ayesha Tanzeem. I say good night on behalf of my team, but I understand that Waqas in Islamabad will take over and will have more questions for his guests. Good night from us.
We just have, Ayesha, thank you, and thank you to your guests. We just have a couple of minutes, and I'd want to make use of them. Sardar Asif, there's a sentiment here in Pakistan often that it's better for the US to leave Afghanistan. That's how peace could return to Pakistan also. But at the same time, we are talking of the US making a hasty withdrawal from Afghanistan. So then what should the US do? How should it exit Afghanistan?
I think it will have to be very carefully choreographed in Afghanistan, because if the ISAF forces leave, it will leave a huge security vacuum, and the security vacuum is one of the worst things that can happen in any situation. I think they'll probably stagger their withdrawal along with the capacity building of the Afghan National Army. Unless and until the Afghan National Army is fully trained, fully armed, and has the requisite numbers, I don't think the United States Army is going to leave in a hurry, because that will lead to mayhem, and it will lead to huge security problems even for Pakistan and other neighbors in the region. So I think it's going to be proportionate. The withdrawal and the strengthening and capacity building of the Afghan National Army are going to go in tandem. If it is not in tandem, then Afghanistan, the vacuum will cause huge problems for everybody.
All right, one final comment, Mr. Chaudhry. Do you think that the advice that Ms. Clinton gave of cutting off money supplies and other sort of help that Pakistan allegedly gives to networks, can that be achieved?
That should have been done a long time back, but I think what Pakistan needs to do is to take the lead on the peace initiative.
All right.
That's a very important thing, because that is how Pakistan will be able to reestablish itself as a leading player in the Afghan endgame, and that's an important area. Pakistan must not hold itself back.
So as you're saying, the focus and all eyes are on the peace initiative in Afghanistan, and as our guest said, that Pakistan could play a role, and it should play a role, but it remains to be seen how strategizing works in the region with all the major players present here. I thank my guests, AVM Shahzad Chaudhry, Sardar Asif Ahmed Ali, who joined us in Lahore. A special thank you to General Richard Myers and Brian Katulis, and my colleague from the VOA, Ayesha Tanzeem, for joining us today, and thank you for watching The Platform. I'm Waqas Rafique. Good night.